The world is becoming more diverse. The question is, are we the people of God becoming more united? I'm Alex Diaz. Welcome to Mosaix Today with Rachel and Mark. On each episode of this podcast, you'll discover unique insights, hear from credible practitioners, and learn promising practices to help you build a healthy, multi-ethnic, culturally intelligent, socially just, and financially sustainable church. The kingdom of God is not segregated. Why on earth is the church? And now, here's your host, Rachel and Mark.
Hello, and welcome to Mosaix Today. I'm Rachel, and I'm here with Mark DeMaz. Today's podcast will be a discussion about justice and how the topic of justice is not peripheral to the church, but kind of central to it. And goodness, I have so many stories from my time as a church planter related to this, but I'll never forget, as a church planter, you're supposed to be out in the community, networking and meeting folks. And my kids were in elementary school at the time, and the PTA president came to me. Our kids were both in third grade together, and she said, "Aren't you a pastor?" And I was like, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Well, my church and all the other churches I've contacted have refused to help a family from our school with a particular issue. And I was just hoping you might be different from the other churches out there." And I'm like, "Well, what's going on?" And she said, "Well, a family that we love that's close to us has applied for asylum status, but it means that they can't have jobs anymore. You're not allowed to work while you're waiting for that processing. And so there's a family of four, and they just don't know how they're going to eat and what they're going to do." And all the other churches we talked to said, "Well, they're from Turkey. They're Muslim. We can't help them." And I was like, "What? Like, this is a justice issue. This is a family that is seeking asylum, that is, trying to save the lives because they have family members at home that have been imprisoned or killed. And they know that the same will happen to them if they return. Like, this is our job to help and to love and to serve." And so, I met the family. Our kids were a similar age, and we formed a relationship. And my gosh, it's been like 5 years. Their asylum status was granted. Now they live in California, but I just got their Christmas card a few months ago, and it reminded me of the importance of the church looking around outside of the doors, right, the walls and our sanctuaries, to say, where is their pain, where is their need, and how can we step up and love people, love our brothers and sisters that God has created in God's image as well. So justice is a big issue, whether or not it relates to, immigration or racism or whatever, systemic poverty, the, prison industrial complex. I mean, you name it, right? So what are your thoughts about justice, Mark? What does that mean to you and to Mosaix?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really appreciate that story. Maybe we'll talk about the immigration work we've done here in Little Rock since 2005. You started the episode, Rachel, by a quote that I've been saying myself for years. Justice is not peripheral to the gospel, it's intrinsic to the gospel. And that's a starting point, folks. If you're listening to this, justice is not peripheral to the gospel, or as Rachel said, to the church. It's intrinsic to the gospel. It's intrinsic to who we are. They can't be separated. I've taken Rachel lately to talking with pastoral audience ministry leaders, and I'll say to a group, how many of you believe we serve a just God? How many of you believe that our God is just? And they all, of course, raise their hands. Well, then I follow up with a question. Well, what's your problem with justice then? Right? We've bifurcated this idea that justice is somehow a peripheral, not intrinsic to the gospel and to the church that we love. In fact, it was Micah 6:8, one of the very first songs I ever learned and led people in worship back in the day, 1983 or so, when I became a Christian, or 1981, I should say. But it was Micah 6:8, right? But to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. I mean, justice is intrinsic to the word of God, should be intrinsic to the church and to our own Christian lives, and not bifurcated as it's become in our politically charged climate today. Now, having said that, and of course, there are so many wonderful voices to listen to read, and to understand justice and mercy and compassion. But even in that verse, Micah 6:8, but to do justice, love mercy, there's a little bit of a nuanced distinction to that, right? And so when I think about it, this is just me, my thoughts, but justice seems to me to be something that you deal with at a structural level. If we're advancing justice, I want to think about how do we make a difference in terms of structural impact. So for instance, mercy or compassion might be us as a church serving food to our neighborhood, right? As we do. And literally right now, I don't know if you can hear the noise, but it's Tuesday, and that means over 1,000 people from the community are getting free 3 or 4 days of groceries from our church. It's a massive operation. It's the largest food distribution in Little Rock, third largest in Central Arkansas. So we're giving this food away. But giving food away to people that are food insecure, the homeless, et cetera, while that's a merciful and compassionate work, and we do that to represent Christ well as people and as a church, it doesn't necessarily deal with the structural problem of why are these people food insecure in the first place. So in terms of justice, it's, in my opinion, and how we approach it as a church, is we look at justice from a structural level and compassion and mercy more from the individual side, or even in the programs that we do like food distribution. For instance, on the justice side of food, one of the reasons people are food insecure is because they live in what's called food deserts. In the city of Little Rock, there's 17 food deserts. What's a food desert? It's an area of a city that the people living there do not have access to healthy meat, vegetables, fruits, etc., because there's not a grocery store anywhere close, or the bus route doesn't run there, or they're senior citizens who cannot get out. They're living in housing projects and low-income housing, etc. And again, there's maybe a liquor store, or maybe you have a convenience store, but you don't, and you can buy chips and Coke and all of that and a hot dog, but you don't have access to healthy food. So among other things, at a structural level, literally as I speak, we are opening a 5,500 square foot grocery store in our facility, along with Carlos Dansby, former NFL football player, to address food insecurity, to bring healthy milk, meat, vegetables, et cetera, to this community. And on top of that, we already operate a mobile market in partnership with the city of Little Rock, where we export fresh fruits and vegetables, et cetera, into food deserts on a weekly basis. So we're taking and trying to address the structure that puts people at hunger. And all that's to say, just around food, that's a little bit is the way I think about it, Rachel, in terms of the nuanced difference between justice, mercy, and compassion. Mercy and compassion, again, serving, but justice really looking at structural and systemic issues and how do we bring change to avoid the problems in the first place.
I love that. And I love that example. And, we had a similar partnership with the food bank at my church plant, but we realized, as you did, that we were in a food desert. That's why it was part of the problem. And so we started an organic garden on our property that some of the homeless folks living in the camp could help tend, along with people from the church. We had a lot of volunteers from the Navy, so that we could enhance that produce and then really partner with other schools or organizations to use land that was right there to provide additional resources. So you're spot on. And, another example I'm reminded of, it's amazing how sometimes kids can see things that we can't and are kind of passionate in leading us to places that we never thought we'd go. Because after, George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and everything else, my kids, granted they're like 9 and 12, they're young, but my son's girlfriend was Black, and he was like, Mom, what if that happened to her? Like, I can't even imagine this. And so they said, is there a Black Lives Matter march going on in our town? And I said, well, I haven't heard of any. And they said, well, can we organize one? And so my 9-year-old daughter walked into the police chief's office and explained to him what she wanted to do and why, and that she'd like to meet in front of the police station. And it was called Stand Up for Kids, Stand Up for Injustice. And she invited her pastor from McKendree UMC to come and do the prayer and to speak. Stephen is just a phenomenal African-American Methodist pastor in downtown Nashville. And he came and inspired these kids, and the school board came out, and then they invited these kids to come and meet with the school board and say, how can we improve our school system so that we have more diverse voices and we're fighting against racism in the public schools? And so it's an example of how, just one moment and kids taking initiative because of their faith, trying to live that out, right, in more than words, and incorporating both the church and the police and the community is now led to these meetings with the school board. So it's truly important, and I think we need to be doing more of it in the church. Why do you think justice is such a hard issue for churches to embrace or to see is crucial for the life and the health of the church?
Yeah, this really goes back to the 1970s and before, with liberation theology out of Central and South America, and the concern within evangelical Christendom in America, particularly, that somehow we would drift away from preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ if we flowed into liberation theology, or what was called then the social gospel. And again, in a majority culture nation of 400 years, some would call it white privilege, we don't recognize that this oppressive systems that exist, that have been perpetuated, handed down, so to speak, from generation to generation, that they exist, and people that are oppressed or marginalized in these systems, they need freedom, and the gospel can in fact set us free. It's also so one reason, in my opinion, is the confusion, the enmeshment of understanding the gospel as social gospel, and somehow that becomes problematic. Another thing that leads us to that is that we tend in America, particularly in the West, to think of the gospel as something that is spoken or deals with the individual heart. So what I call, as you know, Rachel, the capital G gospel. This is the capital G good news of Jesus Christ, salvation by grace through faith in Christ alone, which is the foundation of everything I believe, everything I do. I know it's true for you, Rachel, and the church. We're all about that capital G gospel. That's the foundation. Hear me well. But having said that, we tend, particularly majority culture individuals and organizations, approach that more from an individual standpoint, right? So I want to preach the gospel to Rachel so that she can come to Christ and be saved. But there's also this good news of life, of light, of freedom that is all about loving your neighbor as well, right? Not just an individual finding their way to God, but how do we collectively love our neighbors? How do we see people come to Christ, enfolded into the local church, and be one on earth as it is in heaven, to advance that capital G gospel that we love? And so I think majority culture folks fall into individualistic thinking when it comes to the gospel, and don't understand, as many people of color do, this idea of the collective understanding of the church. And how do we think about that's a cultural intelligent issue, individualistic thinking versus collectivist thinking. So I think that's a problem as well. And thirdly, I think even if you overcome that, if you understand that justice is central to the heart of God, it's what he does on the cross. He makes justice before the Lord in terms of our own individual salvation. If we realize that the capital G gospel is not somehow bifurcated from advancing justice on the street, so to speak, or we understand individual collectivism, I think there's another thing, and that is structurally as churches, we don't necessarily know how to do that well. How do we organize and structure our ministries so we can advance justice, not only compassion and mercy, let me say it like that, but also get at structural systems to dismantle those inequities where they exist, so that we are leveraging our power, position, and privilege, as Christ did in Philippians 2, to come down and to lift others up. And I think that's also a problem, Rachel. Structurally, churches generally don't know how to do that well.
I completely agree. And I think it goes back to churches having that individualistic mindset. Well, I am one church, so, the Gathering or Mosaix, we will do this. This is our job. But we don't look at, how could we become more connectional? How could we work with all churches to try to eradicate whatever, systemic or oppressive issue exists in that entire community, that we are stronger together, and that it means that maybe that one church can't take all the notoriety for whatever they're able to accomplish. But if we as the church were able to really commit ourselves to acts of justice, to do justice, as you said in Micah 6:8, what kind of difference could that make? And how could it change all these people who think that there's nothing in the church for them, that they want nothing to do with God because they haven't seen the actual tangible fruit of this justice work played out. A lot of times I tell pastors, if they want to know what the community really thinks about them, on a Sunday morning, don't go to church, and just ask people nearby, the Walmart greeter or whatnot, hey, is there a church nearby? What do you know about that church up there? And if all they can say is, well, they have a food pantry, or their choir sings a great cantata, that tells you something. If they could say, wow, that church actually started a partnership with every church in the community to ensure that no child goes to bed hungry at night. What kind of difference would that make? So I think, I agree wholeheartedly. We have a lot of work to do when it comes to justice issues. What kind of resources does Mosaix offer for churches that are like, I don't know how to do this? What are my next steps? How can I make this happen?
Yeah, you bet. That's a great question. I want to answer that by first responding to what you just said, Rachel, if I could, because what you're talking about also is a challenge. So we talked about people seeing the gospel as peripheral, not intrinsic. Justice as peripheral, not intrinsic to the gospel. We talked about individual versus collectivist thinking, barriers to this. We talked about how churches don't really know how to structure themselves to advance justice. I'll talk about that in a second. That's your question. But what you also makes me mindful of this, the idea of competition versus cooperation. Certainly people who are baby boomers and just after baby boomers, all of that was about competition. So the churches and that level, that age of leader, by and large, generally speaking, not everyone, but they operated from a competitive mindset. Our church is competitive towards yours. They may not have said that, but that was the general feeling, right? That we're in competition, competing for the same people, or the same notoriety, the same impact in a community. As you well know, being at the higher end of millennials, I won't talk about your age, but as a millennial, right, you know that the lower you go, as you go from baby boomers down to Gen X and so on, the farther you go down in terms of age, the more cooperative things become and not so competitive. And when you have that cooperative spirit, as you're talking about, as an individual, as a pastor, and your church has it, then it opens up your mind to create cooperative partnerships with others in the city, and not to see them, other churches or other organizations, as competitive to your work. So I think that's also been a barrier. Now, in terms of structure, you heard me mention, you asked the question, what does Mosaix do, and how do we help churches structure themselves to advance justice, compassion, and mercy? Let me say it this way. What we advocate and what we can help you do is learn to develop a separate nonprofit. We call it an umbrella nonprofit. So think about it. You're going to have the church, that is a nonprofit, and that church is doing spiritual work. But then think about a second nonprofit opening up an umbrella nonprofit by which you can aggregate justice, compassion, and mercy work in the church. Now, I don't want to get into the whole philosophy, Rachel. We'll talk about that going forward, but just stay with me, folks, for a moment. Obviously, social justice, compassion, and mercy work, that's a spiritual thing. But I want to separate those for a moment and think about this like an American football team. Think about an American football team. It actually has 3 teams on the one team: offense, defense, special teams. Let's think for a moment about a structure within the church by which we can play a defensive game. Let's just call that social justice, compassionate work, while the spiritual team plays the offense, if you will. So what we're talking about here is you have your nonprofit, which is a church, advancing spiritual things: evangelism, discipleship, worship, children's ministry, visiting people in the hospital when they're sick. Think about a spiritual game plan, so to speak, and that's the work of the church. But the church then opens up an umbrella nonprofit and moves any work of justice, compassion, and mercy that it's currently doing under the budget and the auspices of the church under the budget of a newly formed nonprofit. Now, I say an umbrella nonprofit because you want to create one nonprofit focused on holistic needs in a specific community, as opposed to creating 10 nonprofits. If you create 10 nonprofits to do work, that means 10 boards, 10 copiers, 10 tax returns, 10 rent checks, right? It's an inefficient way to work. But if I create one umbrella nonprofit focused on the holistic needs of people living in a specific community, could be a trailer park, could be an apartment complex, could be a zip code, whatever the capacity your church has, we aggregate these works of justice, compassion, mercy under this nonprofit. Why? Because then we can qualify for local, state, and federal grants. Other churches will partner with us like you're talking about. You know, it's interesting, Rachel, churches don't typically write checks to other churches, but they'll write it to your nonprofit when you're doing the work of immigration counseling, working with kids who age out of foster care, providing food into the food deserts, and on I could go, right? They'll get involved with you. And literally, we've got that going on right now on our food distribution. I went out, there's lots of people from other churches that are working in that because it's all done under our nonprofit. And at a structural level, this is something I write about in the book Disruption, in the book The Coming Revolution in Church Economics. Pastors, ministry leaders, think about this. We move justice, compassion, and mercy out from under the budget and the oversight of a church into the budget of an umbrella nonprofit under the oversight of a separate board. Think about these two groups, your church and this nonprofit, as two sisters living in the same house. Again, because you can scale that work, you can create partnerships, and you can qualify for local, state, federal grants, donations from outside the church that your church budget could not otherwise handle. There's much more to say about this, of course, and we will on our podcast going forward. But if you're interested in this philosophy and this structural shift that I believe churches must make, the books Disruption and The Coming Revolution in Church Economics are books that explain this fully.
I read The Coming Revolution in Church Economics this past year, and it like changed my life. It was amazing and phenomenal and so crucial. And I love that it's this reminder that there are all these resources out there. There are all these state and federal grants that no one receives because no one's applying, because churches haven't created this 501c3 that can help us expand our justice. Works of justice in the community and partnerships with others. So it's crucial. It's insightful. It's kind of a way of a future as we try to figure out how to multiply our impact wherever we go. So I love that. I love what you shared. And, I'm mindful of Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so we really need to be mindful that even if we aren't experiencing injustice in our personal lives individually, as you mentioned, that collectively people are suffering, they're struggling, and we need to open our eyes, see what's going on, mobilize teams, work across, church lines or community lines to really enact healthy, transformative change, living out that gospel.
Yeah, and can I say this too, Rachel, along that line? Because again, folks, think about what you might have a heart to do, what you might do individually along the lines of engaging in structural change, systemic issues, as well as compassion and mercy. All that's well and good. What we're talking about at Mosaix today and in Mosaix Global Network is helping churches or organizations structure to play a long game, because this is a long game. In 2005, here's a structural issue. We were just a fledgling church, 3 or 4 years old. We discovered, because we had undocumented immigrants attending our church. Well, we discovered that how do those folks get their immigration status right? How can they do that? If they're in the country in an undocumented status, out of status as it's called, how can that be righted? Well, at our time, there was only 2 options. You go to 2 lawyers in town that charged roughly $300 to $400 an hour, and frankly didn't get anything done other than take your money consistently with empty promises. Or Catholic Charities had a group of nuns who provided immigration counseling to people that were out of status. The problem structurally was that the nuns could only see 15 people a week. They only opened 1 day of the week, but people from all over the state came for this free service. And of course, speaking different languages, et cetera, they didn't know when they got there. If you're the 16th person and you drove 3 or 4 hours to get there and took the day off of work, and you lost money for that day, or even put your job at risk because you're trying to write your status, the nuns turned you away at 15 people. So there was a problem. To make a long story short, in partnership with a gentleman here in town who grew up in Cuba as a missionary, we opened an immigration counseling center in 2005. Today, we've seen over 10,000 people. The average cost is about $300 per case, not per hour, most of that going to filing fees. And we've helped countless people, thousands, get their immigration status correct in this country, which helps our nation, which helps these people. And again, we're working at that at a structural level. So we brought that change. All that's to say is these are some of the structural shifts that take place. And when your church gets known for this, when your church actually sets up a structural nonprofit, an umbrella nonprofit, aggregates its justice, compassion, and mercy work, it leads to all kinds of other opportunities. In our food distribution, we have 30 community partners that come in to provide services to the sea of humanity that show up here 1 or 2 days a week that we wouldn't otherwise provide. For instance, we're a regional health clinic for one of the local hospitals. Backpacks, a lot of churches pack backpacks, right, for kids. Well, we don't pack it. People that pack it bring it to us and distribute it through these means. We do job search and job training and GED. All of that is not something we provide, but because we've set up the umbrella nonprofit, many other community partners come in to provide these services. As your church gets known, things will come. It's almost as if you build it, they will come. And that's how we're opening the grocery store right now. Because of our food distribution and dealing with food insecurity, the Chamber of Commerce, the mayor's office came to us, brought a partner. They're literally going to pay for, along with investors, the opening of this grocery store. Our church is going to generate income. We're going to help to create jobs, lower crime, repurpose the space. The value of our buildings going up, and it positions us for long-term systemic impact. That's what we're talking about, folks. Not just being nice. I mean, that's a great thing as an individual, but structurally, how can we establish churches that are advancing social justice, compassion, and mercy way in a smart and financially sustainable way?
I love that. That's amazing. I don't think there's a better way to end this podcast than with that story, because hopefully, if you're like me listening in, it inspires you to say, wow, what's going on in my community? What steps can I take? As you said, to prepare for like the long game, to be ready to run this marathon of fighting for justice and transforming lives because of it. I love what you guys are doing at Mosaix. I love the resources that you described. And I'm excited for this time together, this podcast, and I'm looking forward to our next one. So if you want to join us for our next podcast, I really hope you do. We are going to delve more deeply into what is a healthy multi-ethnic church. There might be multi-ethnic churches out there, but they're not really healthy. What does that mean? What are the criteria? Mark and I will go deeper into that topic at our next podcast. But thank you for your time today, Mark, and thank you to everybody else who joined us. Reach out and contact us if you want us to know more about you, your context, or if there are people you think we should be reaching out to or stories you want to tell. Thanks again. See you next time on Mosaix Today.
You've been listening to Mosaix Today with Rachel and Mark. Take a moment to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to this podcast. To learn more about who we are, what we do, and why, visit mosaixtoday.info. That's mosaixtoday.info. I'm Alex Diaz. We'll see you next time on Mosaix Today.